On behalf of the Center for the Study of Autism and Christian Community, a very warm welcome to all of you in our webinar, a webinar on autism and sensory processing. The Center for the Study of Autism and Christian Community aims to bring together researchers, practitioners, and other interested parties, anyone who is interested in autism and faith, autism and theology, autism and church. My name is Leon Vlammen. I am the co-director of the center, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to our guest speaker, Dr. Katie Unwin. Katie will talk to us about autism and sensory processing. Katie is postdoctoral research fellow at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre, La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She specializes in autism and sensory processing, so what better person could we possibly have today for our seminar? You can find out more about Katie and her work on her own website, which is www.drkatieunwin.com. So without further ado, I hand over to Katie. Katie, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much for a kind introduction, Leon. It's a real privilege to come and speak to you today. And my topic is, as Leon said, autism and sensory processing. So my name's Katie, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre, which, as you might see from my slide, is part of the School of Psychology and Public Health here in La Trobe University in Melbourne. So my first caveat for my talk is that I'm not a theologian. And so today, although we'll be discussing things to do with the church in our discussion times, the talk is predominantly based on my work currently. So without further ado, let's get going. So I'm going to give an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off with an overview of autism. I'm sure a lot of us here today all know what autism is, but I think it's important when we come from different fields just to talk about some broad definitions so that we can all make sure we're on the same page. I also will give an overview of sensory processing in autism, and related to that I'll talk about some big questions and issues in the area, particularly related to research methods, and then I'm going to talk briefly about my own research into sensory processing in autism. There'll be discussion questions dispersed throughout. The first time will be after the main talk about sensory processing and autism, and then the second one will be after I've spoken about my own research. And I'd like to start by saying that this will be an incredibly brief overview. Sensory processing and autism, as I hope you'll see at the end, is a huge topic, and I could never ever hope to cover it properly in the amount of time we've gotten. So I hope that this will just give you a flavour of the topic area and perhaps give you food for thought for a future inquiry maybe. And I'd love some questions at the end if you have any, and we can talk more in depth about things that particularly interest you. So I'd like to just provide a little bit of context about this talk, because we know that sensory differences impact experience of church, but no one's really studied it. And so, spoiler alert, this is what Leon and I hope to be studying in the coming weeks and months. We're going to be looking at the impact of sensory differences in autism on worship and encountering God. We're really excited to be researching this, and there's a little bit of a teaser there, so hopefully in the future we can tell you about what we find. But for now, let's talk about sensory processing in autism more broadly. Our words matter. We know from the scriptures that our words are powerful, that they can build people up and tear people down. And this is certainly the case within the field of autism. The words I'm going to be using today are autism, autistic, and person with autism. And I'm going to focus on strength-based language. I've made these choices on the basis of empirical research that's been done with autistic people asking about their preferences. Now, ideally, I'd like to ask you all individually what your preferences for my terminology is, but as this is a webinar format, I'm not able to do that. So I give you my apologies in advance if the language that I use isn't in line with what you would like me to be using. So I'm going to use a mix of both person first and identity first language. So autism is a diagnosable condition. We think it occurs in about 1 in 100 or 1 in 70 people. It's very difficult to estimate, hence why there's such a broad range there. And we think it occurs because of differences in brain wiring, although ultimately we don't know the underlying cause. Autism is complex and varied across people, and this we can know for sure. In fact, it's actually described often as a spectrum, as I'm sure you'll know. And what that means is that each individual's presentation of autism, their behaviours, their thinking, their feelings, are very, very different between each person with a diagnosis of autism. But isn't that actually just quite a lot like what it is to be a human? You know, no two of us are alike, and so is it the case within autism. And it's important for us to also remember that autism is a developmental condition. It's lifelong. It's not something that people grow out of. And because of that, we need to be considerate across the ages. I think sometimes maybe we fall into the trap of thinking that it's just a condition for children. And so when someone grows into being an adult and they're autistic, actually it doesn't really matter that they're autistic anymore. We don't need to consider their needs. Well, that's not true. Autism is a developmental condition, and so we need to consider that across the lifespan. And then finally, autism often co-occurs with other conditions. The examples of these are intellectual disability, ADHD, anxiety. And we don't really know why autism co-occurs with these conditions, but it's important for the way that we think about moving forward in research to remember that there are these co-occurring conditions with autism. And so to give an overview of autism, we know that autism can impact how someone feels, how someone thinks, how someone experiences the world around them, and how someone interacts with others. And again, it's not the case that all autistic people will experience all of these things, but they are the broad categories. So to speak more now in terms of the diagnostic criteria for autism, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which is what is currently used often to diagnose autism. And I apologise in advance that I'm going to be using the word symptom within this section, simply to reflect accurately the diagnostic criteria. So autism is divided into two categories of symptoms, and these fall into social communication interaction difficulties, and then the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests, and these include sensory processing. Now, it's not the case that these two categories are completely distinct. Actually, we know from research that they're pretty interrelated, but they've been divided into these two sections to help clinicians think about the symptoms that someone is presenting with to see if the diagnosis of autism would be appropriate for that individual. So now we're going to talk about the main topic of discussion today, sensory processing autism. And I hear you ask, why study, why research sensory processing and behaviour in autism? Well, we know that it actually occurs in up to about 90% of autistic people. Again, estimates vary, but it impacts a really large population of autistic people, so it's important for us to study. Much more important than that, though, the autistic community themselves have told us that it's something that they want to be researched. In 2016, a big survey of autistic individuals revealed that it was in the top 10 research priorities for the next 10 years. And added on to that, we know it has a significant effect on people's lives. Sensory processing is how we engage with our outside world. And so if we have a difference in sensory processing, it can make a lot of daily life things very difficult. Consider for a second trying to go to the supermarket when you find lots of visual stimulation very overwhelming. The supermarket is full with lots of visual detail. And so if you're not able to cope with that amount of visual experience, then actually going to do something like your shopping each week can be an incredibly difficult experience. And so it's important for us to understand more about what's going on with sensory difference in autism. And we also know that sensory processing impacts on other symptoms or outcomes. These can include social difficulties, anxieties, and repetitive behaviours. And so understanding how these things interact may help us to provide supports, particularly in the area of anxiety, which is a current real hot topic at the moment for research and is a real promising area for supporting autistic individuals to reduce their anxiety levels. And so before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about sensory domains or modalities as they're called, because there's debate about the number that exist. Some people say there are 5 senses, others 7, others say 9, others 11. So there's a whole range of variation. But today within my talk, I'm going to be focusing on what I believe to be the top 7. So these include auditory processing, which is to do with hearing. The sense organ related to this is the ear. Visual processing related to seeing. The sense organ is the eyes. Tactile processing, speaking about touch. Olfactory processing, that's smell. Proprioceptive processing, that's to do with movement. Vestibular, and that's to do with balance. And finally, gustatory, which is to do with taste. Now, missing from this list is both pain and also interoception, so understanding senses from the body. And these I do believe are very important, but there's a few reasons why some people consider them not part of the top 7 modalities. So I won't be touching them on much on them this talk. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'd like to talk about them later. So I'm going to give you a brief history of sensory processing in autism. So in 1943, when Leo Kanner first wrote about this condition that he called autism, he did report some sensory symptoms, and these included humming to oneself and also noticing small changes in the room. But then a whole load of time passes, and it's not actually until 2013 that sensory symptoms get added to the diagnostic criteria for autism, which is interesting because it means that it's not until 2013 that sensory symptoms are described as diagnostically relevant. But throughout the years, autistic people themselves have been telling us that they have a differing sensory experience. And so it's very interesting that it's not until very late on that actually it gets added to the diagnostic criteria. But as it's added now, we know it's very, very important. And there are varying descriptions of sensory processing. And this is one of the issues we have within this field, because sensory processing is actually studied by many different groups of people. We have occupational therapists, psychologists, physiotherapists, neuroscientists, and everyone has their own language, their own terminology when they describe sensory processing. And one problem with this is that as researchers, we're actually not very good at talking to each other about what we're finding because we're talking about it in different ways. And added to that, sometimes there can be lots of confusion in talks and when we're thinking about how we can convey our research to the public, because again, we're using different terms. And so I thought I would just offer up some definitions now to describe what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the talk. When I'm talking about sensory processing, I'm talking about some processing that enables us to engage with our outside world. In this process, information is passed through our sense organ to the brain or the spinal cord, where it's processed and organized, and then a response is determined. And that response is what is often referred to as sensory symptoms. These are observable behaviors that indicate a type of sensory processing, and that's how we understand difference. So when I'm talking about different sensory symptoms today, what I'm talking about is different responses to daily stimuli than we would probably expect. The take home from all of these words is essentially different sensory processing leads to different sensory behaviors or symptoms. And that's going to be the focus of our talk today. Different people have tried to describe sensory processing in different ways, but I think the most elegant description comes from Schaff and Lane in 2015, and they describe 4 elements, 4 types of sensory processing. And the first of these is sensory perception. So sensory perception is the ability to accurately perceive or interpret a sensory stimuli. So as an example, if you're standing in a forest of pine trees, you will be able to see the pine trees because of your eyes. The image of the pine tree will be transmitted through your eyes to your retina, and then will travel through to your primary visual cortex right at the back of your brain. But then you're actually in the forest. You can also smell the pine trees. So you can smell through your nose. The sense molecules go up, get converted into a chemical. The chemical molecules get converted into electrical signals, which then get converted into the brain. And that helps us to understand what we're smelling. So big breath in, oh, I'm smelling pine trees. And so this area of perception is about how we accurately perceive the stimulus in front of us. That is a pine tree, and I'm smelling a pine tree. But then sensory integration is the ability to organize, bind, or assimilate multiple or simultaneous sensory stimuli. So this is essentially our ability to understand that the smell and the look of the tree are coming from the same thing, the tree. And they're combined in our brain through actually an incredibly complex process that really we don't understand very well. And then there's sensory reactivity. So sensory reactivity is the ability to modulate the intensity of behavioral response to a given sensory stimuli. Essentially, it's how we react on the basis of what we've perceived. So if we have the smell of the pine tree, and we absolutely hate the smell of pine trees, signals get sent down our spinal cord all the way to our hands, and our hands get lifted up to our nose, and we cover up our nose because, oh, we just want to stop that smell of the pine tree. And that's an example of sensory reactivity. But then we also have sensory interest. So sensory interest is behaviours that indicate that sensory stimuli is actively being sought. Essentially, that our perceptual system, our sensory system, wants more stimulation in particular areas. So let's say, in opposite to what I've talked about before, you love the smell of pine trees. Well, in this scenario, signals get sent down your spinal cord, all the way to your hands, and your hands pull you forward towards the tree, and you give it a big old sniff and get lots and lots of lovely sensory stimuli from sniffing the pine tree. So that's what we describe when we talk about sensory interest. And as I've described here, these are all very interrelated, but this is a really helpful way to think about what sensory processing actually is. Sometimes there are differences in some or all of these systems, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about sensory processing differences, particularly those associated with autism. But actually, the differences are not always bad. In fact, there are quite a lot of strengths that can come from a sensory difference. In 2001, Mochwan and Burak actually put forward a theory of enhanced perceptual functioning, which described this ability they recognise in autism of actually having an enhanced ability for things like visual search. So as an example, here is a picture from the Where's Wally picture books you may have seen when you're a child. And these picture books basically are based on the idea that there's a character called Wally who's somewhere placed within all of this visual mess, and you have to try and find Wally in the scene. I did some work earlier, I found him. He's there in that black square, right in the centre of the frame. And this is an illustration for what we mean by enhanced perceptual functioning, particularly within the visual field. The idea being that someone who has increased ability in visual search might actually be very, very good at honing in immediately on where Wally is, as opposed to having to search through absolutely everything in the scene before they find them. And so I hear you say, well, that's great. That's great that you're really good at where's Wally, you know, if you have an enhancement in your visual processing system. But really, other than bragging rights to your friends, what's that going to do for your life? Well, the concept actually extends to other things that can be incredibly helpful, such as threat identification and surveillance. And so we also can consider not only the visual sense in this particular area, but other senses as well. And this can be defined broadly within savantism. So savantism is this heightened ability that autistic people seem to have for particular things. And one such example is musical ability. So there have been multiple descriptions over time of autistic people having incredibly musical skills, as demonstrated by this little girl here who's playing the violin. And this comes from a strength from a sensory difference. Perhaps it's from increased perceptual ability to understand pitch. Perhaps it's from incredible integration skills, being able to understand the music you want to play, potentially hearing it and be able to put that into practice. We don't really know how this comes about, but there is certainly a strength from a sensory difference in this respect. But then there are also other sensory differences that perhaps may be more difficult to deal with, or there are behaviours which may indicate an underlying sensory perception or integration difficulty. And we can see these as sensory reactivity or sensory interest behaviours. And these are the ones that are described in the DSM-5. And that's a really important point to make, because although we know that sensory processing encompasses these 4 different areas: sensory perception, sensory integration, sensory reactivity, and sensory interest, actually only sensory reactivity and sensory interest are included in the DSM-5 criteria, because these 2 are the only 2 that are actually visible through behaviour. And so to give a bit more detail about what these might look like in autism, the DSM describes hyperreactivity. And this is a state of being overly reactive to sensory input. So as an example, there may be an air conditioning unit which makes a very quiet buzzing noise, which to someone without hyperreactivity wouldn't really bother them. But someone who's hyperreactive to auditory stimuli might hear that tiny little sound as incredibly booming and even painful. And their response, the sensory reactivity response, would be to cover up their ears. But then there's an opposite sensory difference, and this is hyporeactivity, essentially being underreactive to sensory input. So we would expect a response, but in fact there isn't a response. So as an example, there's a chap here reading a book, and we would expect that if it's a loud bang beside him, he would really quickly turn his head and orient to it, but he doesn't. And that's an example of auditory hyporeactivity. And then there's sensory seeking. So this falls into the sensory interest domain. The idea being that you're behaviourally seeking more stimulation. And that might be through, like this little girl is here, picking up a truck, and instead of playing with it like a truck, vroom, vroom, instead she picks it up, looks at the wheels, and watches them as they spin. And that's an example of sensory interest. Now, I've given examples there in both the auditory and the visual domains. But the important thing to say is that you can have any hyporeactivity or sensory seeking behaviours across any of the modalities. And to give some examples, I'm going to now talk through 3 individuals who might have different sensory responses. You might say, well, all of these individuals like you're about to talk about, Katie, they're all autistic, right? So they're all going to have the same sensory profiles. They're all going to have the same sensory reactivity and sensory interests. No, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, everyone on the spectrum has a very different sensory profile. And I'd like to explain a little bit of what that might look like. So this guy here, I'm going to call him autistic person number 1. He is hyperreactive to both sounds and textures. So he hears a very low sound, not actually very distressing in and of itself, you would expect, but for him it's really distressing because to him it's a booming sound. He puts his hand over his ears. Same within the texture domain. So he has a label in the back of his clothes and he just cannot deal with the feeling of the label to such an extent that it feels like a scraping pain. And so he has to cut them out of his clothes. But then he's hyporeactive to temperature. So it's a really, really cold day, -2, and he goes outside and he's not wearing a coat and he doesn't notice. He doesn't notice that it's -2. That would be an example of hyporeactivity to temperature. But then he really seeks out stimulation from lights. So this might be demonstrated by him putting his fingers in front of his eyes and wiggling them so that he gets a really nice light experience, or potentially getting really close to a light source. But as you can see, this individual has lots of different sensory experiences across lots of different modalities and also across lots of different domains, hyporeactivity and sensory seeking. And then we have our example of someone else who's autistic. Now, this lady actually is hyperreactive to light. So lights for her are incredibly painful, and she might cope with this by wearing sunglasses or covering her eyes. But that's interesting because autistic person number 1, who we've described, they love lights, they seek more lights, whereas autistic person number 2 actually finds them really, really painful. But she also is hyporeactive to smells. So where you might expect a smell would incur a reaction from her, it doesn't. But she really loves the feeling of particular textures and she seeks them out. You can see her touching lots of objects with the back of her hand to gain that sensory stimulation. And then finally, you might see where I'm going here, autistic person number 3, a whole different profile all over again. So actually, this autistic person doesn't have any hyperreactivity symptoms, nor any hyporeactivity symptoms, but they absolutely seek out sounds. They really enjoy any kind of sounds, and that could be demonstrated by them potentially making a humming noise themselves or getting very, very close to a sound source. And so, as I hope you can see here, every autistic person has a unique sensory profile. And we need to remember this in church contexts. And this is going to be the crux of our discussion question a little bit later, so please get thinking already. So the big questions in autism research around sensory processing at the moment are, why is sensory processing different in autism compared to those without autism? And why is sensory processing different between autistic people? So why is it the case that between autistic people 1, 2, and 3, they're actually experiencing very different sensory symptoms? That doesn't really make much sense. The problem is we really don't know. we have some clues, we have some theories, but very interestingly, no one theory can explain all of sensory experience, particularly in autism. If you're interested in this topic area, Jamie Ward in 2019 put out a very interesting discussion paper where he compared 4 major theoretical accounts that can explain different aspects of sensory sensitivity. But unfortunately, none of these theoretical accounts could explain all of what we see in sensory difference within autism. And so we're still asking this question today. So one big reason for this is because of measurement issues. These measurement issues limit what we know. And in order to talk about this a bit further, I'm going to revert back to these 4 different aspects of sensory processing I introduced earlier on in the talk. Sensory perception, sensory integration, sensory reactivity, and then also sensory interest. So if we want to look at sensory perception and sensory integration, we can do that through psychophysics and brain imaging. If you're interested, some examples of these things are stimuli detection or discrimination tasks. So this might be where we play someone 2 different tones that are of a different pitch, and we ask them to say which one is a higher pitch. And through asking these things, through forced choice tasks, saying basically you need to pick one, which one's a higher pitch, we're able to establish for them a threshold, essentially the point at which they can start to perceive stimuli. But we can also do studies using EEG, which help us to understand the electrical activity in the brain, or we can do studies with fMRI, so functional MRI, and this would help us to know where the brain is activating and how much it's activating. And so we can, through a series of tasks, tap into sensory perception and sensory integration using psychophysics and brain imaging. The problem is we can't actually test sensory reactivity and sensory interest using these. Instead, we need to use questionnaires and observation measures. And there are some really good ones around. The widely used sensory profile is a parent report measure of sensory symptoms across a whole range of individuals, not just autism. There's a great measure for self-report in autistic adults called the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire by Robertson and Simmons, which was published in 2009. And then there's also some clinician observation techniques. So this is where an individual's in the lab, they get administered particular tasks, and that through that, a clinician can observe how they respond to those tasks and understand something about their sensory reactivity and their sensory interest. But the problem that we have is that we can't tap in really to sensory perception and sensory integration through questionnaires and observations, even though some people have tried. But then to add to all of these issues, as if that wasn't enough, there are also issues associated to each of these types of measurement. So as an example, the great thing is that psychophysics and brain imaging experiments give us really objective data, objective scientific data, whereas questionnaires and observations can be slightly more subjective. They can be influenced by bias, by a whole range of things. But physics experiments, even though they're really objective, which is great, actually are less real world. So they're arguably a lot less applicable to real life scenarios. Whereas questionnaires and observations, even though they're more subjective, they actually have more real world relevance. And so, as you can see here, if you want to measure sensory reactivity and sensory interest in a very objective way, we're a little bit stuck because we can't use the methods we would need to. Likewise, for sensory perception integration, if we want to measure them in a really real world way, again, we're a little bit stuck. So some people have suggested, well, why don't, because we can't measure all of sensory processing just with one technique, why don't we use all techniques with each research participant? And that way, we can try and understand a research participant's sensory perception, sensory integration, sensory reactivity, and sensory interest by using a combination of techniques. The problem with this is that particularly psychophysics and brain imaging experiments require the ability to understand instructions. And although a large proportion of autistic people do have very high IQs, and this wouldn't be a problem, there are also a proportion of them, about 40%, that have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And for this reason, they might not be able to understand instructions and therefore wouldn't be able to do the tasks. Relatedly, we couldn't do psychophysics and brain imaging studies very easily on very young children with autism because you need to remain still in the scanner. And although there are some great paradigms around putting sleeping autistic children in the scanners, you can only get structural scans that way, you can't get functional scans. And also, a lot of these tasks are very boring. Believe me, I've taken part in them myself in the past, and they require a real high level of engagement. And that might be difficult if someone with autism potentially has a co-occurring diagnosis of ADHD. And so it's very difficult to do these studies with a whole range of autistic individuals. There's very good data with autistic individuals from psychophysics and brain imaging studies, but only those that can engage in these experiments. Unfortunately, those perhaps who are have lower intellectual ability, who aren't able to remain still for a long period, and who aren't able to engage for a long period, these people are excluded from the study, which mean that we don't really understand much about their sensory perception and sensory integration. Then, for those individuals that we can't use psychophysics and brain imaging experiments, and we end up using questionnaires and observation measures, there are issues associated with these measures as well, particularly bias and parent report, and also the fact that clinician observation is context specific. And so there's so much more I could say here, but the point I really want to make is that actually, as a field, we're really struggling to push through and understanding more about sensory processing and autism because of these measurement issues that we have. So now, after that whole lot of talking, I thought we'd have a discussion question. So what does it mean for the church that autistic sensory processing is different for each individual? So what does it mean for the church that autistic sensory processing is different for each individual? And I could even expand this question out to say, what does it mean for the church that all of us have different sensory processing? Now, the way this is going to work is that I'm going to pause for a full 3 minutes. So there'll be a full 3 minutes of silence. And this, we hope, will allow you to have some thinking time. And will also allow you time to write a response in the Q&A box. So the Q&A function may look like this little image I have here of 2 question bubbles together. So if you click on that, you can type a response. And then what we'll do after the 3 minutes are up, we will have a little discussion, a little feedback session about what people thought about this question. So the 3 minutes start now. Have a think and please respond. Thanks very much. Speak about
the summary of the discussion that we had. The questions will be read by Hannah and myself, and the answers, when it's Katie's answer, that will be read by Hannah, and my own answer I will read myself. First question: the complex nature of sensory profiles raises the temptation to do nothing at all. Have you seen any good examples of what can be done despite the complexities?
Churches should be considering everybody's needs anyway, regardless of whether they have autism or not. But this is not always done that well. Perhaps it is not that difficult to respond to individuals' needs. It just starts with asking the question, having the conversation.
How can we start that conversation with individuals, especially given the sensitivity over language and names for things?
If you are autistic and feel you need a sensory difference addressed, don't be afraid to be bold and approach your church leaders. But the onus should be on those who are hoping to support all individuals in the church. You can put out an open call at the beginning of a service or provide an email address to make it easier for people to report their experiences. The most important thing is that everyone makes their expectations clear up front. We can't always do everything, but we should do everything we can, even if that means more work for us. What is the theological basis for churches accommodating the sensory needs of individuals?
It really starts with listening to people. And then theologically, we should consider, what is the worship service for? Whose church is it anyway? Is it there for the needs of a clique who haven't wanted to change anything for 20 years? No, theologically speaking, it is God's church in the first place, which shifts the perspective. Are we trying to create an autism-friendly church, or is this God's church, and are we looking at how God is welcoming each and every one of us? And then there is something about bearing each other's burdens, isn't there? What are we willing to do? In Corinthians, Paul speaks of the body of Christ. As Katie has explained very well, we don't even understand our own bodies at times. In the same way, we don't always understand the whole body of Christ. Maybe we don't understand our autistic members, and maybe autistic members don't understand non-autistic members. But as one body, we need to care for each other. We also need to learn from each other. Maybe it's important to say that to listen to autistic persons and their needs is not an act of charity. No, there is strength in autism as well, and the church can benefit from learning about particular sensitivities. What we see very often is that when you adapt something for someone with particular needs, it actually benefits the whole community. For example, if an autistic person reports that the sound mixing is not good, non-autistic people will also benefit from it being done better.
About what I've been researching into for the last few years. And so I'm going to give you the briefest of overviews, and it will be incredibly brief. So feel free to please ask questions if you're interested in something particular at the end. Multisensory environments and autism. So this was the focus of my PhD, which I did at Cardiff University. And just to integrate what I'm about to talk about with what I have been talking about, the idea is that essentially we all have different sensory profiles. Particularly in autism, there are some sensory differences and some sensory needs. And because of these sensory needs, sensory interventions have been designed essentially to support individuals who have high sensory needs. And this has led to the rise of these things called multisensory environments. So multisensory environments, also called sensory rooms or Schmizellen rooms, there's an image of one here. This is a purpose-built one that we have at Cardiff University that we built for my PhD. And these rooms contain a variety of sensory equipment which engage the different senses. So to give an example of a few pieces of equipment, this long, tall, thin thing on the left-hand side of your screen is called a bubble tube. It's about 2 meters tall. It contains water. Bubbles flow continuously in an upward direction, and the color changes. Engaging with this piece of equipment provides visual stimulation, not only from the bubbles, but also from the color change. But interestingly, it also provides both auditory and tactile stimulation, because there's a slight buzzing sound that comes from the motor and a slight vibration of the tube because of the motor as well. And that one really is a very highly sensory piece of equipment. Whereas there's other equipment, such as the tactile board, which is far less sensory, inverted commas, that you have to really engage with in order to get stimulation from it. And very importantly for this part of the talk, you can control a lot of the pieces of equipment with either an iPad or switches in order to modulate your own sensory input according to your preferences. So a tiny bit of history. These rooms came to prominence in about 1980. That's when we first started hearing about them. And they were used originally for individuals with severe and profound mental disability. That's what it was termed in the 1980s. And essentially, it was just a leisure opportunity. But since then, it's become incredibly widely used. They're very expensive rooms, costing upwards of £20,000, and yet most special needs schools in the UK have one, in spite of the fact that there is incredibly limited research about not only whether they work, but also about how we can use them best. Unfortunately, the research that does exist is very, very poor quality, and there are very few studies on individuals with autism spectrum disorders, autism for short. To give you one example, the only study to date, other than the study that I conducted, contained 6 autistic children. There was no comparison condition, nor a comparison group, and they were just sort of monitored across a year. And so it's difficult for us to know really what the effect of the multisensory environment was on these individuals, because we had nothing to compare it to. And so this area really is crying out for research. And that's why I ended up doing my PhD in this topic. So I used a sequential mixed methods approach, which meant I began with interview studies, so qualitative studies, and I asked 10 practitioners who worked regularly with autistic individuals within these sensory rooms what they thought about what was happening. And they gave me some incredibly interesting insights. And after I conducted a thematic analysis, there were 6 emergent themes from the data. And these were benefits to cognition, behaviour and mood from using these rooms, distinct properties that facilitate benefits, the rooms are best used when they're centred on the child's needs, that the practitioner has to play an active role in order for there to be benefit, that these rooms are useful for teaching and learning, but also that there are challenges to MSE use. The important thing to remember here is that these were the beliefs and experiences of practitioners. And so I didn't really know whether they were just the beliefs and experiences of those 10 individuals, or whether they extended more broadly. And so what I did was I carried out a quantitative study, converting items from these themes into statements, 27 statements to be exact, and I sent that out as a survey and got responses from 102 practitioners. And these 102 practitioners told me how much they agreed with each statement on a 5-point Likert scale. Very interestingly, even though I reverse worded a large proportion of the questions, we actually found high levels of endorsement from these 102 practitioners with the original 10 interviewed practitioners. And what this is suggesting to us is what that original 10 described to me actually seemed to be the opinion of a larger group of individuals as well. And so from this data that I gathered from practitioners, I then designed a quantitative study, a behavioural study that took place in our centre at Cardiff University, where the sensory room was based. So to tell you a bit more about that study now, the practitioners told us that providing control of the multisensory environment enabled benefits. And this is really interesting to us because there are current theories around sensory perception in autism and sensory experiences being affected by the individual having control of their environment or not. Particularly in 2013, Robertson and Simmons brought out a paper which was the first paper interviewing autistic adults, where interestingly, autistic adults described that their sensory experiences were much more comfortable when they could control their stimulation. So it was interesting to us that even though we didn't ask the practitioners, they themselves told us that they thought that providing control of the sensory room to the autistic individuals actually enabled benefits. So we wanted to test empirically if this was the case. So one at a time, I brought 41 autistic children into the centre. They were aged between 4 and 12 years. I conducted an ADOS assessment on them to understand their level of autism symptoms, and also I conducted ability assessments. As you can see from this IQ range from 46 to 142, I had individuals in my study across the full spectrum of ability, with 100 being the mean level of ability for each individual's age. So what happened was I brought these children one-on-one into the centre with their parent, and I used the sensory room with them in 2 conditions. In one condition, they engaged with each of these pieces of equipment in turn for 3 minutes, and they had control of all of the sensory stimulation that they were provided through an iPad. Whereas in the other condition, they engaged with all of the same equipment, except for they didn't have the iPad this time, and the sensory equipment changed automatically without them engaging. So they weren't able to modulate the level of sensory input that they were getting in order to meet their own needs. And what I did was that I video recorded these sessions, and then I behaviourally coded. And for those who are interested, these sessions were counterbalanced, and my utterances were also highly controlled to make sure that there were no differences between conditions. So I did measure things like heart rate variability and activity, which I don't have time to talk about today, but I measured also the behaviours produced in the sensory room. And this was an important research decision because, as I said before, a large proportion of my sample actually had abilities that were below 70, so had a co-occurring intellectual disability. And because of that, I couldn't explicitly ask them. So instead, I had to measure their behaviour to see what they were experiencing in the sensory room. And I chose what I was going to measure, the outcomes I was going to measure, on the basis of what the practitioners from the early studies told me were important to measure. So I measured attention, anxiety, enjoyment, repetitive motor behaviours, so these are things like flapping the hands, any repetitive behaviour, sensory behaviours, social behaviour, and speech. So, results. When I provided control of the sensory equipment to the children in the rooms, I found a reduction in repetitive motor behaviours, both in terms of their frequency and their duration. So essentially they were doing less repetitive motor behaviours, and the motor behaviours that they did produce continued for far less time. So just to orient you to these graphs, all of the upcoming graphs, the blue bar is the condition where I provided them control of their sensory input using the iPad, and the green graph is the condition where they had no control, and instead the equipment just changed automatically. And I also found that when I provided the children with control, their sensory behaviours reduced, both again in terms of frequency and duration. I also found an increase in attention in the control condition. So when they were provided with control of the sensory equipment, their attention increased. This graph is slightly misleading because of the way the attention was coded, a high score relates to low attention. And I also found that when the children had control, the child's vocalizations and stereotyped idiosyncratic speech reduced, both in terms of frequency and duration. So what we've shown here is that providing control of the sensory room does seem to modulate some behaviours. However, there was no impact of the condition on mood or social communication. There's lots of interesting things that we can talk about from this, but seeing the time, we need to move on. Please feel free to ask questions if you'd like to. So now on to the work that I'm doing currently in my postdoctoral research fellowship. At the moment, I've got the slightly big task of trying to reduce the age of autism diagnosis through sensory behaviours. So, support is often needed by many autistic children and their families. And research has shown that when we provide supports early on in life, they tend to be more successful. An explanation of this is around neuroplasticity, the idea being that when we're a child, we're like a sponge, we pick things up very easily. Our brain networks are very, in inverted commas, plastic, so they're able to change very easily. But as we grow older, we're less able to assimilate things that are given to us, to assimilate change, because our brains become less and less plastic. They become essentially hardwired in a particular way, and so forming a habit can become more difficult. And because of that, providing supports later on in life actually seems to show that actually it's not so successful, certainly not as successful as providing these supports earlier in life. And evidence shows that early supports can enable better outcomes more broadly for both the family and also for the individual. However, we aren't diagnosing autism until later in childhood, which seems to be limiting the efficacy of these supports. One explanation for this is because of long waiting lists, but also it's because of poor tools in identifying early. We're just not very good yet at looking out for the signs of autism, identifying it early, diagnosing it early, and providing support early. There is promise in early sensory behaviours. So studies have indicated the primacy of sensory neural pathways, with some even suggesting that these neural pathways are present prenatally, so even while baby is in utero. And research suggests that sensory symptoms in autism are visible early in development, perhaps even at 6 to 12 months. And this is much before the social symptoms of autism may occur, which suggests that actually studying sensory behaviours may help us to identify autism earlier than if we just studied social behaviours. So we ask the question, can we use sensory symptoms to identify autism early? And if so, how? Because of this, I decided to create a measure. The measure I've created is called SAW, or the Sensory Observation Autism Rating Scale. And SAW is essentially a list of behaviours and descriptions which, following validation, which we're currently doing at the moment, could be used hopefully by both clinicians and parents to observe and score the frequency and duration of sensory behaviours in young children that may indicate that child needs a diagnosis of autism. And this sensory measure was co-produced with both autistic individuals and also caregivers of autistic children. And it was devised using the sensory literature and then followed up with autistic people and caregivers. The aim of the project as a whole is to investigate if items on the SAW, or SAW total score, essentially the total number of sensory behaviours produced by these children, can actually predict diagnosis when these children are just aged 11 to 36 months. And just to say here, this is actually very early because currently we can only diagnose autism in Australia at about age 2 because that's when social symptoms occur. But actually people often aren't getting diagnosed until about age 4, whereas in the UK we're not really diagnosing to age 6 or 7. So here, age 11 to 36 months would be incredible because that would mean we're starting to diagnose much, much earlier. So in attempting to predict autism diagnosis through using my new measure, the Sensory Observation Autism Rating Scale, I took a very long and arduous process, which I won't go into now, but essentially I created it using the research literature. I then refined it with stakeholders and sensory experts, and then the stage we're currently at now is of behavioural coding. So 2 students of mine will be behaviourally coding free play data of children, very young children, that we have at the centre. So these videos show children playing with toys, and my students will be coding both the frequency and the duration of sensory behaviours that we have listed in the SAW. And then from that, we will hopefully be able to predict whether SAW is indicating a diagnosis of either autism or something else. And then if that is the case, we hope to be able to see if individual items on the SAW seem to predict diagnosis, and that could be used by either caregivers or parents to start to pick up on potential high likelihood of autism in their children. And the important thing to say here is that both of our coders will be blinded to diagnosis, and so they won't know what diagnosis the child goes on to get, which hopefully will provide validity to the work that we're doing. So I have to end there because of time, and also I've been talking for far too long. So before we go to our final discussion questions, I'd just like to thank a whole group of people that have contributed to this work. Most importantly, and first and foremost, the practitioners and families who took part in this research. They gave up their valuable time, and without them this wouldn't have been possible. And because of what they gave up, we're able to learn a little bit more about not only how sensory rooms impact behaviour for autistic individuals and may be able to use for maximum benefit, but also potentially we may be able to reduce the age of diagnosis of autism using these sensory symptoms. So we're very, very grateful to these people. I'm also very grateful as a very young researcher to my supervisors, Dr. Catherine Jones and Dr. Georgie Powell at Cardiff University, supervised by PhD, and also Professor Alison Lane, Dr. Josie Barbaro and Professor Cheryl Disanayake, who are my current supervisors at the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre. I also need to thank my funders, And most importantly as well, you for listening today. Thank you very much. And if you want to get in touch, my details are there at the bottom, or my Twitter handle is at the bottom of the different screens. So now for some fun discussion and some questions. The first discussion question we have here is, what can we take away from all of this that I've discussed to our respective contexts, whether that's in church settings, in home settings, across different contexts? And then also, I thought it may be an interesting question for us to discuss, considering this is a research seminar. What would be useful to research for the good of the church, potentially around this topic? And then also, please feel free to put any questions for me in the chat, particularly as I've had to sort of brush over things very quickly. So once again, I will just leave a little bit of time now. We'll leave 3 minutes for people to have a think and add some questions to the chat, and then Hannah will very kindly open us up again for the discussion. So thanks very much.
Here is the summary of the second discussion that we had in this webinar. The questions will be read again by Hannah and myself. Hannah will again read Katie's responses, and I will read my own.
When we think of church, we often think of a communal experience. Should we think instead of a service with a variety of experiences and expectations? Would that help?
Yes, we tend to think of the worship service as a single unit, when it is actually made up of lots of different people with different roles and sensory profiles. So yes, I think that's a good observation. The worship service is not just a unified whole. There is a lot of variety and diversity, and at the same time, we are coming together as one unified body of Christ. That might be a metaphor, but it's one that goes a long way. In my experience so far, in the interviews I've done, people are quite willing to compromise. The autistic people I've interviewed said that they would like their needs to be taken into account when it comes to the worship service, but also that they realize not everything is possible and not everything can be changed to suit their particular needs. They're just asking for understanding in the first place. But there's a lot that we can do in churches, which won't have a massive effect on everyone, yet will make a huge difference for that one individual. So we should think about diversity, but also unity, which doesn't mean uniformity, of course. Next question, stressors can increase as children grow older. Would that mean some children aren't diagnosed early simply because their environment works well for them?
Yes, that's certainly possible, particularly because parents tend to be good intrinsically at adapting the environment for their children's needs, and because parents tend to be extremely good at advocating for their children. Interestingly, though, the opposite has been described from a research point of view. This is because as children get older, they potentially cope better with their sensory experiences. So we see sensory issues being less significant, tapering off as children get older and approach adulthood.
Some practitioners suggest that, at least for very young people, putting them in a situation where they have to ask someone to change something in the environment might be beneficial. Can this help to explain your PhD results? An example is the Hainan method, where it is suggested that therapists interrupt repetitive behaviors to encourage verbal interaction. So if our goal is to alter a child's behavior, do we need to control the control that they have over their environment?
I think that raises a question about whether we should be attempting to reduce repetitive behaviors. I think we should not be trying to reduce repetitive behaviors, because to interrupt them in order to try and stimulate verbal interaction is a way of saying, I'm right, you're wrong, to an autistic person with regards to social rules, and I don't think we should be doing that. However, the practitioners did tell us that for a lot of their individuals, the repetitive behaviours could lead to a lot of distress, although in other literature it is noted that they can be a stress reliever. The behaviours were causing stress and limiting learning. So in a school setting, they were hoping to support individuals to potentially reduce the behaviours at particular points in order to promote learning, and that's why we went on to measure that. But we are not trying to reduce those behaviours just because that is, in some way, a good thing to do. So the idea that we should try to control the control that autistic people have could be detrimental, which I think is the point that the question is getting at. Really, we should be giving autistic people themselves the tools to control their stimulation in any way that they need. So if an individual needs earmuffs to muffle sound, we should support that and not be working to get that individual to take those headphones off. To do otherwise, there is a bias to neurotypical people, expecting everyone to respond to things in the same way.
From the research, what interventions or supports are you advocating? What kinds of practices are envisaged as a result of early diagnosis?
We don't automatically want to intervene with repetitive behaviours or stimming. There is data coming from autistic people that repetitive behaviours reduce anxiety and are a positive thing. The objective data supports that too. Stimming can reduce physiological metrics, showing that the person is more comfortable. So I wouldn't suggest that we should be intervening. There are interventions, but I do not advocate them. I tested repetitive behaviours in my study as a matter of scientific rigour because the practitioners told me that they were important, but I am not adding a value judgment on the reduction of those behaviours. In the same way, some early supports are controversial and I don't advocate those. But there is evidence for providing support for families. For example, providing access to support groups can be beneficial for both family and child. A lot of parents describe to us in the literature that having an autistic child brings a lot of challenges that parents of non-autistic children don't understand. This leaves them feeling misunderstood and places a huge burden on their well-being. Wonderfully, this is being researched more and more.
Would having more sensory options in church increase interaction from autistic individuals?
It's all about the individual, whether or not they have autism. Having lots of different options would be great. For example, having a quiet space where you can control the volume of the service would be great. Allow free choice over where to sit, especially in relation to the position of speakers. The most wonderful thing we can do is think about different options and discuss them with the individual.
Yes, and maybe it's not always a case of having many options, but of having the right option. In my interviews, I have heard that people feel frowned upon for fidgeting because that is not socially acceptable behavior. People are saying they would bring their own fidget toys or bracelets, but they don't want it to be seen as a sign that they are being rude or not engaging. Now, underlying that is, who as a church body are we? And how accepting are we of those kind of behaviors? Spiritual fidgeting, why not? Next question, how do you help churches to understand behaviors such as headbanging or biting being about sensory distress rather than naughtiness?
This is a very real concern of multiple parents who don't even feel welcome in church because their child is naughty, when that is not true at all. I am a big believer in information. As a researcher, I believe that knowledge is a way to move forward. To share with the church community more understanding of autism can help tremendously. Knowledge is key.
There's a lot about how sensory profiles change with age or appear to change. That is, as teenagers learning to mask, for example. Can you provide any insights into the research on that?
This is a big question in research at the moment, and I will be studying it with one of my students later this year. The best evidence we have to date, from a meta-analysis of studies, shows that sensory symptoms are higher in children and lower in adults. We also see that the lower the IQ, the higher the sensory symptoms seem to be. Interestingly, in research, we don't seem to see a difference between males and females in terms of sensory symptoms. This could be because brain differences are not gender specific, or it could be that we don't have the right measurement tools at the moment. In autism literature, we are aware that females are sometimes not picked up as having autism because they are good at hiding their symptoms. This causes them distress. So we need to start understanding more and more about the autistic profile of females and exploring more about how sensory symptoms relate to this.
Thanks for watching this webinar. If you would like to receive our newsletter and keep up to date with future webinars or other events that we organize, please get in touch by emailing us at csacc@abdn.ac.uk. Thank you.